Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Code and the Coding Coders Who Code It. I'm your host, Drew Bragg, and today I'm joined by author extraordinaire Noel Rappin. Noel, why don't you introduce yourself for those who don't know you?
Sure. As you said, my name's Noel. My voice is a little scratchy today. I apologize to everybody. I am currently a staff engineer at Chime Financial, and you may have heard of me through multiple Ruby language books, starting with Rails test prescriptions several years ago. More recently, modern front-end development with Rails, about Rails 7 stuff. And most recently, and what I hope we're going to be talking about today, I have been the author, technically co-author, but author of the new version of Programming Ruby, the Pickaxe Book, which just as we are recording this, has just come out in its initial early release beta format.
Yeah, I'm very excited for it. The Pickaxe Book is kind of a staple in our community, so it's great to see it get updated. If I remember correctly, the last version that came out only covered Ruby 2.0, right?
Yep, 2013.
So for those of you who are new to the show, the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask Noel 3 questions. I'm going to ask him what he's working on, what's a blocker that he has, and if he doesn't have a current blocker, what's a blocker he recently had, and how did he solve it? And then we're going to wrap up by letting Noel share something new or interesting that he's recently learned or discovered. Doesn't even have to be coding related, but I have a feeling I know what it's going to be related to. So with all that being said, Noel, what are you working on?
So we'll focus on the book. What I'm working on for that is the Pickaxe Book. It's a new version. It is about something in the neighbor. If you have the previous version, it's going to be about like 50%, 60, 70% new. Depends on how you define it. It is a hard thing to copy. I can see it back there because it's that big, thick one. It's not going to be
the
as
biggest
thick.
one back there. Yeah.
It's not going to be as thick in the new version because the previous version is about half full print documentation of the entire Ruby standard library API. We're not doing that in print.
Okay.
For several reasons. Most of which being that you can look that stuff up pretty easily.
Trees, got it.
Yeah, and also trees. We will have something in that place, I think, but we have not completely decided on what.
Okay.
There's several new things about the book. For one thing, as you said, the most recent version of the book covered Ruby 2.0. There's 8 or 9 versions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 0, 1, 2 versions since then. That have all added or subtracted fun things. So we will be so that we cover all of that stuff. So that's all the way from like the safe navigation operator, which I think was 2.3, through all of the the 2-line stuff, through pattern matching and ractors and typed Ruby RBS in the new features, the couple of new syntax features that it will be in Ruby 3.2. I haven't written the thing about the new data object yet, but it will be in there somewhere. So yeah, it will be Ruby 3.2 will beat this book, the final version of this book out. So the final version of the book will cover Ruby 3.2.
That's awesome.
So yeah, so we've got a bunch of new features. We have sort of a new, what's the best way to put this? A new environment for developers in that the original versions of the book. So the first version of the book came out in 2001 and was updated several times through 2013. And at that time, the assumption was that people were coming to Ruby from an already new Perl or C++ or Java. That's not necessarily true now. People are a little bit more likely to come to Ruby as a first language. They are much, much less likely to come to Ruby from Perl, but they're more likely to know JavaScript or Python or have somewhat slightly different set of incoming knowledge. So the descriptions in the book reflect that. And I think another thing is like somewhat more subtly, less subtly, there's a lot of new tooling. Blender was not in the previous version of the book. Like RuboCup was not in the previous version of the book. Like all of these things are going to get covered. The third-party tooling environment. And then there's just like 9 more years of learning how people learn Ruby and what is basic and foundational to the language and what is more advanced. And that I think shifts more than we think it does. That there are pieces of syntax that were considered advanced, in 2013, like the most obvious example is the arrow lambda, the stabby lambda syntax, which was relatively new but is now very common in Rails code and in Ruby code. So there's a little bit of a back and forth between things moving from the like referencey section of the book to the tutorial section of the book and back and forth, depending on how foundational they seem to being able to understand a good sized Ruby program.
Okay. So the book sounds like it's going to be pretty well suited for anyone new to Ruby coming in, trying to learn it and get going. Are you also kind of getting into the weeds enough for it to be a more intermediate and advanced level Rubyist
Yeah,
book?
yeah, I expect to. Yes, I expect. First of all, if you're even if you're an expert person and you haven't kept up with the last couple versions, which I think covers a lot of people, it's got a complete discussion of pattern matching and RBS and sorbet and a couple things that are relative. Sorbet is obviously not core Ruby, but things that are relatively new, and also the language reference, the full language reference, which is not in the current beta, but will be shipping by the end of the year. I think we'll have things there that I think even expert. I mean, I learned a bunch of things while I was writing this book, so
Sure.
I assume that many expert Rubyists will also learn things from reading it.
Right. There's only so much you can cram in your head, so there's
Yeah.
always something to learn. And it's interesting you brought up that you're going to include or already include sorbet in the book. How did
Mhm.
you choose what tools to include? Obviously, the tooling ecosystem drastically different than the previous version, and the
Sure.
tooling ecosystem could change quite a bit. And as we've seen, like with Rails 7, it does sort of change sometimes fast. How do you decide what is considered core enough to the Ruby ecosystem to include in a book like this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's something that I kind of spent a lot of time debating with my editor, with a couple of people who I bounce ideas off of. So the tooling, you're right, the tooling infrastructure changes faster than the core language, like significantly. Like that's one of the things that was really became super clear as I started digging into what needed to change in the book, was that the sections on tooling felt far more out of date than the sections on like how the object model works. So I think that there's two principles in the book, one of which is that we included third-party tools where I felt like they had significant, really significant mind share, more significant mind share, especially than the official tool in their like area. And that area was something that we were covering. So, and the second principle was we decided not to be quite as full a reference for the third-party tools in general as we are for the core tools.
Okay.
Um, just kind of a that way lies madness uh,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
response. So
You could write entire books on some of the tools. So
exactly, and
I
entire
get
books have
that.
been
Yeah.
written. Yeah, yeah. So a lot of the third-party tool stuff is here's something you will see like often, and here's a little bit of a guide to it, and
Okay.
here's where you can get more information. But so our spec qualifies is that our spec actually was in the previous version of the book, but under the old syntax, so it had to be updated. But for instance, sorbet, even though typed Ruby is a small percentage of I think Ruby code being written, a very very high percentage of the typed Ruby code is sorbet rather than RBS, so that qualified. I mean, bundler's not really a third party tool anymore.
Right.
We talk about that a lot. Yard for documentation. The previous book only talked about RDoc.
Okay.
We added a little bit of yeah. There's actually turns out not a whole lot to discuss about Yard if you've already talked about RDoc. So those are the documentation tools. There's something really Rack. I spent a lot of time on Rack, which is
Great.
technically a third party tool, but I think is pretty foundational to
And
understanding.
and if I remember correctly, Rack 3 recently came out,
Yeah,
right? That's pretty
yeah,
new. Are you going to be
yeah.
on covering Rack 3?
I actually I wrote the Rack thing just after Rack 3 came out, so it does cover
Okay.
Rack 3. So
Awesome.
yeah, so the previous book had a chapter called Ruby on the Web, which talked about CGI and talked about
Mhm.
ERB, and we don't I took out the stuff on the CGI, like using Ruby as a CGI library, although the CGI utilities we talked about because that's
Okay.
a lot of Ruby's like web-based utilities are still in that CGI. So in a module named CGI. But then I decided to talk about Rack as being foundational to anything else that Ruby's doing with the web. And then we talked about Sinatra.
Okay.
Because Sinatra is sort of an exception to that mindshare thing, but it is also like very, very easy to show how to get up and running a Sinatra app relative to a Rails app or any of the other ones.
Right.
So we do talk a little bit about Sinatra and then point to Rails and the other things, but
Okay.
it didn't seem worth it to spend 10 pages giving a very brief overview of Rails when much better overviews of Rails exist in the
Yeah,
world.
there are plenty of great books that are almost equally as big on
Yeah.
Rails. So you can get you can go deep there. So when you were kind of tasked with updating this book,
Mhm.
that I mean, I don't want to say everybody and generalize it, but a fair amount of Rubyists out there are going to know the Pickaxe Book if you say the
Yeah.
Pickaxe Book. So it's kind of core. Like, where do you start with something like that? Like, hey, it hasn't been updated in
S-
what's 9+
Yeah.
years, and it's
So
it's so many versions behind.
I
Where's
know.
that starting point?
So, what happened is that the very beginning was one of my roles at Chime is to run Ruby onboarding, and one of the parts of Ruby onboarding is here's where you go to look for more information about Ruby, and it was honestly like kind of embarrassing. Like here's the seminal book in the because it's not just the Pickaxe book. There's a whole slew of Ruby books that came out in like the early 2010s that have not been updated. So it's the Pickaxe book and it's Eloquent Ruby and it's Ruby Under a Microscope, and all these like really good books about Ruby. Well-grounded Rubyist has been updated, um, but and it was like this doesn't look it's not a good look that all of these books that all I would have to say about all of these books is they're increasingly getting out of date. And
Okay.
I thought, well, I can actually like maybe do something about this, which was a weird thought to have. Like that I'm that okay, well, I've been a Ruby developer for a long time. I'm a Ruby author. Huh. And I obviously written for Pragmatic for a decade or so, and I emailed them and I was like, "Do you have any plans to do this? And if not, do you want some?" And Dave Rankin, who's the current CEO of Pragmatic, got back to me, and he dealt with the other authors. So I don't know and can't really speak to what happened between Pragmatic and Dave Thomas and Andy Hunt and Chad Fowler, who are the previous three authors, but ultimately determined that they were not imminently planning on working
Okay.
on a new version of the book. And they asked me to pitch. So that's the first thing I did was I went through the existing book, sort of chapter by chapter at a very high level. And I was like, okay, this mostly works. And so this chapter shouldn't be here anymore because the topic isn't interesting anymore. Like, so that was what I did. I went through chapter by chapter and I wrote them a proposal, basically. I said, it looks like we'll probably have to change about half the book. And they said, great. We went back and well, I mean, not immediately. We went back and forth a little bit.
Okay.
We went back and forth. There's some like logistical negotiations in terms of contracts and like payment and finances and things like that.
Okay.
Again, a lot of that, to the extent that that dealt with the existing authors, I was not part of that.
Okay.
Um, but eventually they said, "Here you go," and then it's this sort of weird puzzle of going through the book like bit by bit and going like, okay, is this paragraph still hold? Do I still believe everything in this? Like, is there something in the writing that needs to be changed? Is there something in the explanation that needs to be changed? Is something new happening? We round up one of the things that happens in anything that's been around for us, you have like a legacy code problem,
Yeah.
essentially, where you have a chapter and then you build up text in another chapter, and for various weird reasons, like the ordering is not ideal because the second chapter was written later. We moved around the order of stuff in the tutorial section of the book a little bit because there was a lot of things that were referencing later stuff.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Am I talking about this too much? Is this too in the
No,
weeds?
no, no. It's
Uh,
keep going.
uh, you'll stop me
No,
if this gets.
yeah, no, absolutely. It's a very interesting topic because we all write applications. That's the majority of our writing. Sometimes we'll write an article. Maybe some listeners have written like an ebook, but this is not a small book. And I think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine that updating a book of this magnitude is a lot different than writing a book from scratch.
It isn't, it isn't, because there are parts of it that are writing from scratch.
Okay.
So like, there's a lot of a lot of parts of it that are, there's the whole section on bundlers writing from scratch, the whole section on whatever is writing from scratch. But the parts of the book that are pre-existing, it's kind of a puzzle. We're talking about the Ruby object model, and you think like, is this still the most important thing to talk about the Ruby object model? Like, does it still make sense to talk about classes first and methods second? Does this example still make sense? Is the code style of this example up to date? is this example completely obviated by a new method in the Ruby standard library that replaces
Right.
this example completely, which happened in one or two cases. That there was an example that basically rewrote the tally method in array. So it becomes this, it becomes a little bit of, a logic problem of merging the existing author voice with the things that need to be new, with the things that need to be explained slightly differently, because we're not talking to Perl developers anymore, or any of like a dozen reasons why we might want to tweak the language of something that's being described in the book. Happily, like Dave and Andy and Chad left me with this great foundation of
Yeah.
really what is still a really clear description of how Ruby works. And so it's just a question of grafting that onto how Ruby works now and making sure that explanation is still clear for developers in 2022.
So as you're moving through, there's a fair amount of changes to the Ruby language, not even touching on Ruby 3, just going from Ruby 2.0 all the way up to 2.7. A lot of things added, changed. So how do you kind of keep track of all of these things and the iteration of them, and identify those bits that need updating? Because, hey, this no longer applies because now setting a method returns a symbol, so maybe there's a part in metaprogramming that's different.
Yeah.
Or you get the safe nav, so we got to cover that. How do you organize everything that's changed and then start to figure it out where it goes?
Yeah. So the first of all is just figuring out what's changed. The official documentation is great for that. The website, the Ruby language website's official documentation lists all of the change logs for all of the previous Ruby versions. So that's
Yeah.
a good start. Victor Shepelev has a website called Ruby References, which has a very nice overview of Ruby's evolution. It doesn't go all the way back to Ruby 2.0 in all of its parts, but it was a very helpful listing of like organized by there's this Ruby evolution page, which is just like, here are the changes in expressions in each version, and here are the changes to the objects in each version. And once that, I think actually that came up in the middle of the year. I don't think it was up when I started on this, but it
Okay.
wound up being very helpful check on what I was putting in and what wasn't putting in. So
Okay.
that's how I kept track of changes. And then it becomes a question of like, okay, is this common enough that it needs to go in the tutorial section? Is it something that we can hold off till the language reference section? How prominent does this change need to be? What in the previous book, what existing text is like rendered moot by this change?
Right.
Some of that stuff is really like, some of that stuff is really kind of subtle. The array function that is map, that is now most commonly called map, was pretty common. It's called map because other languages call it map, but Ruby also has it. You can also call it collect in Ruby.
Yeah.
And the original book did in some spots, and I made them consistent. And
Okay.
similarly, like the function which we now really commonly call reduce, because other languages call it reduce, but which for a long time Rubyists tended to call inject.
Mhm.
Similarly, like just like that level
Right.
of like cleanup. And you hope
Sure.
you catch everything, because it's
Yeah.
really confusing if you don't.
Yeah. And Ruby's a very expressive language, for better or for worse. You can write the same bit of code a
Yeah.
number of different ways. A block can be curly braces on either side, or you can do it as a do end. And
Yeah.
how do you land on a style for that? Is it a lot of,
We,
okay, this is the existing style from the book, and I'm going to stay to it mostly close, or I have this style and this is what we're going with?
I made kind of an editorial decision that we were gonna every code thing in the book had to pass standard
Nice.
RB, Justin
Awesome.
Searle's standard library,
Yeah. Great library.
except in the case where there was a specific reason not to, because we were trying to show off a language feature that like
Makes sense.
is you know I mean, you're trying to show off something that standard would flag but you
Yeah.
still need to show some of those things. So unless there
Right.
was a reason, unless there was an in-text reason not to, all the code matches standard. So whatever
Fairness.
whatever those rules are.
So do you
Um,
cover standard in the book as a tooling item?
I'm actually writing that now.
Great.
We're gonna have a section. There's a section. We're gonna have a section on Ruby style, um, that is gonna cover Rubocop and standard, and probably Ruby format if it comes out soon and quickly enough.
Okay.
Um, uh, and also the idea that Ruby's really flexible, and you might not want to listen to any of
Right,
these.
right. Yeah.
Um,
Link back to Wise
and
Poignant Guide to
yeah,
Ruby.
yeah, and then also kind of style in the existing chapter in the book actually talks about duck typing and really leaning into Ruby's dynamism.
Hmm.
So it's not just style in terms of like two spaces and double quotes and whatever, but also style in terms of like, don't check the classes of things, like trust Ruby to do the right thing, and lean into duck typing and the sort of dynamic typing nature of it. And here's where some of the really dynamic techniques are appropriate, and here's where they're not.
Okay.
I'm working on that right now, so some of that is subject to change. It's literally
Very cool.
the open
Yeah.
file in my editor as I talk about this.
Okay. One part of the book that you kind of hinted at on Twitter that I got really excited about was the I can't look it up section. The part that's basically parts of Ruby's that are
Yes.
symbols and therefore very difficult to Google. Just like,
Yeah.
what is this symbol? I guess, how do you come up with not just obviously it's somewhat easy to put just like, yeah, this is a random symbol that might be hard to Google, but like, how do you find the proper name for anything in
Okay.
that appendix?
Yeah. So this is short, but I'm very, very happy with it. It's only a couple pages, but it's a list of like, this is, if you have greater than equals less than, you want to look that up under spaceship operator, because that's
Right.
what Ruby
Yeah.
people call it. And there's no way you would know that if you hadn't heard somebody say
Yeah.
it. So I'm going to tell it
Sure.
to you. So there's like I'm looking at it right now. There's like a 15 or 20 of them, maybe. So the list came out of the index from the previous book.
Okay. There you go.
The index had a bunch of symbols in it, and I was like, okay, well, that counts. And there were a
Right.
couple that were new, obviously. So like the safe navigation operator, which I probably should also call the lonely person operator in the appendix. But you can find it as safe navigation. And then it was just like, for the most part, actually, it's pretty clear what people call most of them, what you would
Okay.
be able to Google them from if you've used them and if you've been in discussion with people. So like, to know that the asterisk is called a splat, like
Yeah.
there aren't too many other options for that in terms of what Rubyists call it, stabby lambda.
Yeah. And that's, but I think it's a good one for either juniors or someone new to the language or programming in general, things like that, to have that ability to go, this is a random symbol. I don't know what to Google, because do I just Google asterisks in Ruby to find out that it's called splat? Or I think that's what I'm excited about, is it will give a kind of a common ground for these things that when we say splat in our heads, we immediately see the asterisks because we've been doing it for so long, where someone who just started learning a month ago is going to be like, what is splat? And it will work in both directions, I think.
Yeah. As I'm looking at this, there's probably a couple more that could stand to be on there. Like bang is not in there as the end of a method, bang method. But yeah, it's got, I don't know, a little more than a dozen of them. And I had originally done something kind of similar for our internal wiki as part of onboarding. And I was like, this is actually, I was like, this makes me happy. Like people should have access to this. Because it is a problem, I think. It's not just a Ruby problem, but I think that it's very Rubyish to have these sort of pet names for some of these symbols.
Sure. Yeah.
And then it becomes kind of this unwritten lore, and you want to have that written down somewhere at least.
Of course. So you did talk a lot about some of the challenges of writing the book, because the book already existed. Some of it was updating those parts. Some of it was whole new sections, identifying the parts of the language that changed. If you had to because the next question in the podcast is what kind of blockers do you have? Or if you don't have a current blocker,
Yeah.
what's a recent blocker you had and how did you solve it? If you like pick a blocker that either really kicked your butt or something that you're still sort of struggling with the best path forward, or just something to sum up, I guess, the best blocker.
So there's actually kind of a funny blocker that you probably wouldn't think of, but the so let's see what's the best way to say this. So I write the book in Markdown basically, and Pragmatic has a proprietary build system that converts the Markdown to PDF and EPUB and whatever.
Okay.
This book in particular has extensions to that build system that, if you're familiar with the previous book, there are all kinds of places where there's live Ruby code in the book and it gets executed as part of the build.
Okay.
So you'll see code samples, and then at the end of the sample, and there'll be like a comment at the end of a line showing what the value of that line is. And those are all produced dynamically by the build system. You get the run code. So I inherited that code too as part of the book. And that code was basically written by Dave Thomas in like 2001. So you have code written by really like one of the best Ruby developers ever, but 20 years old using 20-year-old standards. So just sort of navigating, and also code that I think, Dave probably didn't think he was writing for other people
to
look at. So it's brilliant. Like, it's brilliant code. It's very clever, but I had to make a couple of tweaks to it. And that wound up being a little bit of a blocker because I am not Dave Thomas, and in along many axes. But I think we managed to put the book out, so I got through it. But yeah, so that's a blocker. A blocker is, not only was there like legacy book, but there was also legacy code that I had to understand well enough to be able to make it work.
That is definitely an interesting challenge that I was not expecting you to say. Like, yeah, my biggest blocker writing this book was legacy code.
It was incredibly, like, okay, it was a little bit intimidating just to get, so, the contract gets signed and Pragmatic says, okay, you now have access to the repo we've created a new repo. And like, it's extremely intimidating to just get the repo. Like, it was a week or so before I was like able to psych myself up to even touch it.
Right.
Because obviously, like, the book is, it was my first introduction to Ruby. It was a lot of people's first introductions to Ruby. There's a lot here. And then to see this code that is, I'm not sure exactly, but I think that a lot of it is probably the oldest Ruby code that I've ever looked at that's been in continuous use. And Dave Thomas wrote this, and you need to make a couple of tweaks to it. Like, that's
no, I get that. That's a daunting task.
It's intimidating. But it seems to be, so far it seems to be working. So I haven't ruined the code.
Okay. So the book is currently available EPUB in what you would call a beta version, which means you're going to keep updating it and changing it.
Yeah, current version is, I'm going to check, it's somewhere north of 300, the first 300 pages of the book. It's like about the first 330 some odd pages of the book. I expect that the rest of the book that is not the API reference will come in by the end of the year. Although I already think that the table of contents that's in the book right now is going to change a little bit. But that'll come in by the end of the year, and then it will depend on what we decide to do with the API reference section. And then there's another round of technical review. So I expect the physical book to be printed sometime in the spring.
Great. That was my next question, is when can we get physical? Because as much as I enjoy being able to pop it on any device, anywhere, there's something wonderful about having a physical copy of a book and being able to touch it and add my notes and highlight and whatever. So always enjoy having the physical copy. So that's awesome. So this covers up to Ruby 3.2, which will be out by the time the book comes out.
Ruby releases typically come out on December 25th every year, like whatever they have done by then.
Yeah, our Christmas present from Santa Matt's. Best day of the year, right? But so as Ruby continues to evolve, do you expect maybe to be on a more a faster cadence rather than waiting another almost decade to update the book?
In my head, and this is not something that I don't know if in my head, yes.
Right.
The actual cadence is up to Pragmatic, really.
Right. Okay.
I would be I would be like, I doubt very much that like Ruby 3.3 would have enough changes to require a whole new version, but
Sure.
sometime in the year or two after that, I would imagine. I don't know. This is all like, the future is the future
Yeah.
is hard to predict, and it is not necessarily my decision. I should say also, tangentially to this, is that I also, in addition to writing this book for Pragmatic, I have also taken on a role as a Ruby series editor, which means
Okay.
that I'm looking for and working with people who want to write Ruby books for Pragmatic,
Awesome.
um, and helping them get their proposals together, and then helping pitch those proposals to Pragmatic.
Oh, that is
So
awesome.
if you anybody listening to this, um, thinks I've always wanted to write a Ruby book for Pragmatic, and you have an idea, um, definitely get in touch, because uh, that's something that I do for them.
That's very cool. Do you have any tips for people who maybe they don't exactly have a well-formed idea, but they're like, it would be so cool to write a book on Ruby.
Yeah,
How should I formulate my idea? Or I have a half-baked idea. How do I fully bake it?
I think that so there's a couple of ways to sort of to sort of tackle that. One of which I think is to get in touch with me, and I can help you like work it out and see what your idea is. Pragmatic on the website has a list of what they look for in proposals, and it is mostly like an outline and
Okay.
a sense of, and a way to, and can you describe what the audience for this is,
Okay.
are the bulk of it. And it's worth kind of thinking about the outline in terms of, um, what do you expect the reader to be able to do at the end of this book that they couldn't do at the beginning of this book?
Okay.
And then on a chapter by chapter basis.
Okay.
If you've done abstracts for conference talks, like each chapter is basically like an abstract for its own conference talk, and then
Okay.
they'll sort of get put together.
Got it.
And that's one
That's
way to look
awesome.
at it anyway.
Sure. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Um, giving the outline of what it should be without necessarily having all of the meat yet.
Yeah.
A lot of
The
sense.
important thing is to focus on what the person reading it is going to be able to do.
Right.
How they're gonna what they're actually going to be able to change in the world as a result of the information that you're giving them. So
Very cool. So normally we'd close with sort of a share something new or cool or interesting. It doesn't have to be coding related, but I'm going to kind of tweak that a little bit and say, what was your favorite part about writing this book?
so I mean, we talked about the appendix, which is small but makes me very happy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That
I think my
qualifies.
favorite, yeah, yeah. I think that it's been tremendously satisfying to be able to sort of lock in the new stuff and see how it integrates with the existing stuff, like in general, like more than
Okay.
any specific thing, but to be able to say like, oh, I can talk about bundler now, and that locks into what we were already saying about gems. And now, hey, the book is stronger because we're talking about the new thing. That process I think has been very satisfying.
Okay. So as people read through the beta that you is now
Mhm.
released, people can go on and buy and kind of get a preview of it'll get updated as
Yep.
you release more
Yep.
content. Is there a way to give you feedback on the beta and say, hey,
Yes.
this verbiage was a little confusing, or are you going to have a section on X, or I
Yeah.
feel like this was
Um,
incomplete?
this is definitely, yes, we're definitely looking for feedback. You can contact me on Twitter, at least for the moment, at Noel Rapp,
Okay.
NOELRAP, assuming Twitter doesn't implode by the time we have actually finished this. There's also devtalk.com is the official Pragmatic site for like feedback and forums. So if you go to
Okay.
devtalk.com and if you search for programming Ruby 3.2, there's actually a landing page for it. That is the official place to post errors. It's the official place to post general discussions. I'll see it. I'll definitely see it. I'll definitely see stuff that comes via Twitter, if you point it in my direction. a
Great.
little bit. Those are the two best ways to get feedback. Definitely interested in people's feedback. The book is by no means locked, so if people have
Right.
comments about how it goes, definitely
Great.
they
Well,
should
that
share
that
them.
also that also finishes up my next question is how can people find you on the internet? Is there any other ways that people might be able to interact with you on
Yeah.
the internet?
So right. So the best way to find me is on the best places to find me is noelrappin.com, which actually I need to update with this new book, which is a book. It's my website. It's a very dormant blog and newsletter, which will every time I've started to write a newsletter post, my brain thinks, "Why aren't you working on the Pickaxe book?"
Sure.
And I just have not been able to get anything out on that newsletter, but it has been active in the past, and there's some archives up there, and it will be active again in the future. I'll probably put out a "What the heck's going on" post soon.
Yeah.
So that's good. Twitter, Noel Rapp. I hang out a little bit on the Ruby Discord and Brandon Weaver's Ruby Learning Discord, so you can
Okay.
I'll see comments that go there. Those are probably the best ways.
That's
To reach
awesome.
me.
We'll include all of that in the show notes. Is there anything else you wanted to add on, talk about,
No,
mention that
yeah.
we haven't?
No, I think that's a lot of what I was wanted to talk about in the book. I just hope people like it and give it a
Yeah.
chance to take a look. I think Ruby developers of any level will find something useful here. I hope so.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining the show today. It was a great show. I'm super excited to go through the book, and I will include everything, including a link to the book, where to buy it, in the show notes. And again, man, thank you for coming on and chatting with me. It was great to pick your brain on a slightly not coding related, but still very coding related topic.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.